By 1787, Versailles, for all its splendor, was becoming a relic of past glories. While Frenchmen were gripped by a new age of learning, Versailles, and those who lived here, represented a backward-looking society where birth outweighed ability. Versailles stood also for the extravagance of French kings, from Louis XIV to the present Louis XVI. The richness they created drained their treasuries. The American War of Independence, to which France contributed not only revolutionary ideas, but arms, money, and men, had proven a crushing burden on the royal wealth. But the Hall of Mirrors seemed to reflect the image of a stable monarchy, assured of its power. A deceptive image. France was impatient for something new. Currents of reform were at work, triggering immense forces soon to rock both state and church. Divine right of kings, up to now Europe's great stabilizer, was even being questioned. In 1787, the man who ruled over Versailles and France by divine right was His Most Christian Majesty Louis XVI, an absolute monarch who was so slow-witted that even his courtiers sometimes laughed at him. A heavy eater and drinker, a hunter and do-it-yourself locksmith. Above all, a good husband and father. The Queen, Marie Antoinette, shared her husband's devotion to their children, the Dauphin, his brother and sister. But Marie Antoinette was very different from the plodding, simple king. She'd come to Versailles from her father's imperial court at Vienna, a proud, pleasure-loving, flirtatious girl. Many Frenchmen saw in her a symbol of their country's ills. Crisis came to Versailles when Louis, still looking for a way to pay his bills, planned a new land tax. The result was furor among the landowning nobility. Leading nobles defied the king, refused to pay. Convene the Estates General, they challenged. This half-forgotten assembly had last met by royal pleasure 173 years before. Soon the whole country was crying for a new session at which to air its grievances. Beyond the park of Versailles, Paris and the provinces flared into turmoil. The king stalled for time, finally gave in. Elections to the Estates General were ordered. May 1789, after months of preparation, the estates met in Versailles, with an opening procession of the three orders. Here were the nobles, whose resistance to royal taxation had brought about the meeting. Also in gold-trimmed robes, the clergy, mostly from the church's own nobility. But by now, the center of hopes for a constitution to limit the king's power had shifted to the third estate, the commoners, dressed by government order in modest black, but already on its way to becoming a potent political force. Of the reluctant hosts to this assembly, an American tourist who watched the procession wrote in his diary, "Neither the king nor queen appeared too well pleased." As the estates began their sessions, the commoners outnumbered nobles and clergy. To keep them in check, the king and his ministers tried to rig the voting, so the upper two estates, clergy and nobility, would have control, as had always been the custom. No, said the third, and for more than a month refused to budge. It was forced into action when Louis had it locked out of its meeting hall. The members moved to a nearby indoor tennis court. A dominating figure was a member named Mirabeau, who was soon to defy royal authority. When a court messenger hinted of force, The bull-voiced Mirabeau answered for them all. We are here by the will of the people and can be removed only by force of bayonets. Presided over by an astronomer named Bailly, the members of the Third Estate made the tennis court the scene of an historic oath, never to separate and to keep on assembling wherever necessary until the Constitution is established. The king submitted finally to the oath of the tennis court. The Third Estate, joined eventually by the other estates, became the assembly of the French nation. In Paris, 15 miles away, there were clashes between citizens and troops, following rumors that king and court planned to disband the assembly by force to restore the monarch's absolute authority. Someone remembered the Invalides, an old soldier's home used also as weapons storehouse. Parisians, already panicky over a threatened bread famine, took up the cry, "To arms, to arms." The crowd surged into the Invalides over nervous protests from the superintendent. From the courtyard, 20 cannons were confiscated, and from the cellars, 26,000 rifles were taken. By now, the crowd had picked a target for its frenzy. The goal was the Bastille, a thick, walled fortress where political prisoners were kept, guarded by a military garrison. The armed people of Paris converged on this symbol of royal authority. The brief siege ended when a gate was opened mysteriously from inside, giving the crowd access. Within minutes of surrendering his garrison, the warden was hacked to pieces, his head borne off on a pike by a crowd angered by its losses, 100 killed in the battle. But when it was over, only 7 prisoners were found in the Bastille. More important, one of Europe's most impregnable fortresses, symbol of the old order, had been stormed and taken by a mob. It was dismantled by the people of Paris. On that day, July 14th, 1789, Louis XVI came back to Versailles from an unsuccessful day's hunting and made a one-word entry in his diary. Rien. Nothing. The uprising in Paris continued, finally forcing Louis to take notice. 3 days after the Bastille, he came to the rebellion-torn capital. There he was met by officials of a new city government, set up independently of royal approval. Strong man of Paris now was its liberal military commander, Lafayette. On the spur of the moment, the king was offered and accepted the new tricolored cockade of revolution. White still for the monarchy, but with red and blue added, the colors of a Paris in revolt. In this impromptu ceremony of acceptance, Louis bowed to a new order for France, an order based on king and constitution. The nobility's fear of taxes, they had never paid any, and the Paris mob's fear of massacre had combined to start a revolution. But the French Revolution had deeper roots than these. It owed much of its origin to salons like this one, where a brilliantly intellectual society met to criticize the existing order. There had been Voltaire, who said, "I disapprove of what you say, but will defend to the death your right to say it." It was in the salons of Paris that Franklin and later Jefferson met to exchange ideas with the philosophers and politicians of the day. The American Revolution received much from and gave much to the life and work of French intellectuals. The Social Contract was one of the most influential books of the age, authored by a man whose impact, even today, is great. A man who believed that society was a contract in which the rulers, too, had obligations. He was the Swiss-born Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a romantic in an age of reason. Rousseau believed that man was over-civilized, that he must return to a more natural state. He rejected the formality of his day and urged a return to nature, as in this informal garden. But by 1789, the ideas that sparked the revolution had already been overtaken by events. In the countryside, home of 4 Frenchmen out of 5, the peasants still bore heavy feudal duties. Under these, they paid or provided rents, taxes, payments, personal services to the landowners, members of nobility and clergy, in return for use of the land. When news came of successful revolts in the cities, peasants all over France were quick to follow suit. The target was the local chateau, seat of the landowner. Here, the feudal charters which gave the landlord his rights were seized by the peasants and destroyed. Often the chateau itself, a symbol of feudalism, was demolished too. In some cases, the landowner was killed by angry peasants. Revolution was now reaching the farthest corners of France. Unrest in the countryside soon brought political results. In a single night, the Assembly voted to end feudal privileges of nobility and clergy. Then the Assembly adopted a Declaration of the Rights of Man. This was the spirit of 1789. Liberty, equality, government for the people. These reforms brought rejoicing to many, but to certain members of the nobility, the loss of privileges was too much. They packed their bags and left the country, among them the king's brother. At Versailles alone, this exodus emptied 2 wings of the palace. For those who remained behind at Versailles, the pleasures of court life continued. One night in October 1789, officers of the king's bodyguard held a banquet graced by the presence of the Queen. They toasted her, sang loyal songs. Some said they trampled underfoot the red, white, and blue cockade, symbol of revolution. News of this incident reached a Paris already made restless by economic troubles and by the king's resistance to the new constitution. An angry mob of Parisians, led by women, marched to Versailles. Lafayette's troops checked the mob, but in the courtyard below it continued to demonstrate, shouting now for the king to come to Paris. Louis refused haughtily to take notice of the mob. Then Lafayette's advice prevailed, and the king and queen appeared on the balcony together with Lafayette. When Louis said he would be willing to go to Paris, the mob changed from threats to cheers. At last, a strange procession set out from Versailles to Paris. In the carriage, the royal family, not realizing they would never again see the palace. Power in France had passed to Paris, to the Assembly and the mob. Versailles was history. Symbolically, the royal procession was escorted on its way by the triumphant demonstrators. Leading the procession, the heads of 2 royal bodyguards on pikes. Now came a time of relative calm. For the first anniversary of the fall of the Bastille, Paris built an outdoor altar on which to celebrate France's unity. In a spirit of common labor, Lafayette's National Guard and the people turned out to prepare the ground for this feast of federation, a word borrowed from the American Revolution. Even the king, now called first public official of the nation, lent a hand. At the ceremony, the king won applause by swearing publicly to uphold the new system. The revolution seemed to be complete. The monarchy had ceased to be absolute and had become constitutional, almost painlessly.